We need to educate the American public about what safety and security is and make this a coffee table conversation where we discuss how ridiculous and how useless these weapons are.
That's the voice of Terrell Jermaine Starr, host of the foreign policy podcast Black Diplomats. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back to Press the Button. That was the voice of Angela Kellett, our new Roger L. Hale Fellow, who will be helping with Press the Button. Welcome to Plowshares, Angela. Tom, I don't know how your weekend went, but my God, did you see a couple weeks ago that Kate Cohn appeared on Jeopardy and won a match? Kate's over at the Federation of American Scientists. Congratulations, Kate. I feel like I was much less productive this weekend.
I did not see that, but congratulations. That's incredible.
But Tom, how was your weekend?
Oh, Michelle, thanks for asking. I had a great weekend. I actually got out of town. I was able to go up to southern Massachusetts into the Berkshire Mountains and see some friends of mine from college who I hadn't seen in a few years. So it was really nice to get out of D.C. for a while, go see some fall foliage, catch up with some old friends, do some biking and hiking. So it was a good time. How was yours?
It was great. My partner and I went up to the top of the Washington Monument, so got some excellent views. Highly recommend.
Excellent. I'll have to try that. And some brief news updates for our listeners. F.W. de Klerk, former president of South Africa, died last week. This is notable for a number of reasons, but also under his leadership, South Africa dismantled the apartheid system and released Nelson Mandela from prison. And Mandela was then elected president of the country. And the two of them, de Klerk and Mandela, shared the Nobel Peace Prize. But what's also notable is that South Africa, during this process, became the first country in the world to give up its nuclear weapons voluntarily. So that's a great non-proliferation success story that we don't want to forget. And just a heads up that we are recording this show Monday, and President Biden and President Xi of China will meet virtually later today as they try to avoid tensions over Taiwan, cybersecurity, and nuclear weapons. And we of course, wish them all the luck in that process. And lastly, Senator Patrick Leahy just announced his retirement after 8 terms in the Senate. So that'll make next year's elections even more interesting than they already would have been. And today on Early Warning, nuclear policy is back in the news, and we discuss no first use and sole purpose and what it all means for the Biden administration's nuclear posture review. So stay tuned.
After that, I sit down with Terrell Jermaine Starr, the founder and host of the Black Diplomats podcast. He's also non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We have a wide-ranging conversation on Iran, on Russia and China, what we're seeing with hypersonic missiles in the region, and more. And, getting back to this question of what actually is security and what constitutes creating a safe and secure environment for folks.
Can't wait to hear that. And as usual, if you like what you hear, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us make the show better. And with that, let's get into the episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. This week, we are checking in on the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, which is due out early next year. And as our listeners know, this review will set U.S. nuclear policy on the big questions, like what are nuclear weapons for and when might we use them? The National Security Council will reportedly meet this month to discuss no first use and sole purpose, which President Biden has supported in the past. And right on cue, the critics are out with their arguments about why U.S. nuclear policy is just fine as it is, no changes needed. To help us understand the finer points of this debate, we have Jessica Sleight, Program Director at Global Zero. Jessica, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So Jessica, let's get right into it. Help us understand what is being considered. Biden has talked about both no first use and sole purpose. What do these terms mean and how do they differ?
Yeah, so adoption of either no first use or sole purpose would constitute a change to what is called U.S. declaratory policy, which articulates intentions and reasoning behind the U.S. nuclear arsenal. It's a bit of a broad term, but we'll get into it and we'll start with no first use. U.S. adoption of a no first use policy means that the U.S. would commit to never using or threatening to use nuclear weapons first. It's a statement that outlines the circumstances for nuclear employment and really brings more clarity to U.S. nuclear decisions about nuclear use. Now, when advocates talk about no first use, we're also talking about the changes to U.S. nuclear forces and posturing necessary to make a no first use commitment credible. So things like taking nuclear weapons off launch ready alert and ending the practice of launch on warning and phasing out land-based nuclear weapons. Basically, what it means is that if you're worried about reducing the risk of nuclear use by accident, miscalculation, and by launch on false warning, no first use is going to address and mitigate that risk. Sole purpose, on the other hand, it's quite similar, but it is different. It's a statement on why the U.S. maintains a nuclear arsenal, and that can take different forms. So during his campaign, Biden reiterated his belief that the U.S. should establish that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter and, if necessary, retaliate against a nuclear attack. This is perhaps closest to a no first use commitment, but again, it's more of a guiding principle that would leave some ambiguity and a little bit of wiggle room for Biden. And so we can also see other iterations of sole purpose popping up, saying sole purpose is to deter against nuclear threats, or saying sole purpose is to deter threats where conventional weapons are not up to the mission. So even within sole purpose, there's kind of a spectrum that we're working with here. So we won't kind of know exactly what we're working with until we get to the nuclear posture review comes out. But both would represent a move by the US to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security. We're just talking about different levels.
It almost seems to me like sole purpose is kind of trying to have it both ways. Like you're kind of in the space moving towards no first use, but you're not really willing to go there.
Yeah, it's a step to no first use, but let me hedge my bets a little bit to make it a little more palatable, perhaps, for some who might oppose a strict no first use.
Now, as I mentioned, the critics are out now in force, and they're criticizing these proposed policies, and they're pointing to efforts by China to expand its arsenal and saying, of course, now is not the time because China is resurgent. And they're looking at the opposition from the U.S. allies and saying, oh, this will destroy NATO. We can't do this. How do you respond to those arguments?
Yeah, so I think we first need to acknowledge that China's activities are troubling, and they're another sign that nuclear armed states are moving in the wrong direction. That does not mean that the US cannot make progress on reducing the role of nuclear weapons. And in fact, the increased instability and the heightened risk of conflict between nuclear armed states because of China's moves, because of Russia's moves, the US, that all adds to the need for leadership, for someone to step in and say, we've seen this movie before. We recognize the urgent and unacceptably high risk of nuclear use that is happening right now, and we recognize our role in perpetuating that risk. And for the US to step up and say, we're confident in our nuclear arsenal and the ability of our nuclear arsenal to deter nuclear use and nuclear threats against the United States and its allies. And we are confident in our non-nuclear capabilities and even our non-military capabilities to deter and respond to non-nuclear threats. And not only that, we recognize that involving ourselves in a reaction or action-reaction cycle where we are investing in new capabilities and then China and Russia are investing in other capabilities to beat our new capabilities, this is all dangerous, it's all wasteful, and we have other urgent priorities here, and we have a strong nuclear deterrent, we have a strong non-nuclear deterrent, and we can kind of rest our laurels there. There's also a need to engage China. And something that a change in declaratory policy can do is actually open up means of communication on how nuclear weapons states view their own nuclear arsenals and how they view threats. So we know China is unlikely to come to the table on numbers and on limiting nuclear weapons because of a large disparity still between the US and China. It's important to mention that even if China quadrupled their nuclear stockpile, which is what the recent Pentagon threat assessment asserted was China's plan, the US would still have over 3 times the number of nuclear weapons than China does. By de-emphasizing the role of nuclear weapons in US national security, we then can open up this conversation with other nuclear armed states, including China and Russia and others, to say, let's have this conversation, let's build some transparency and some confidence building measures here. When it comes to US allies, any change to US nuclear policy needs to be done in close consultation with our allies. I don't think anyone is suggesting otherwise. Biden knows this, his administration knows this, and I actually think that's part of the reason that this questionnaire was sent to allies asking for their input on US nuclear policy. Again, that doesn't mean that we shut down a conversation if allies are expressing concerns about US change in declaratory policy. What I think we need to recognize is that change is scary and change cannot just be done overnight. It is going to take conversations with our allies to say, okay, you have concerns. What are those concerns exactly? Let's address them. And we have confidence that we can address those concerns without relying on maintaining a outsized role for nuclear weapons in our security. Whether it's sole purpose or whether it's no first use, we can have a strong US and allied security stance in the world and be mitigating the risk of nuclear use by accident, by miscalculation, by unintended escalation. These are things that often go underemphasized or even underestimated when we're talking with our allies about security issues. The role of current US nuclear posture and current US nuclear policy in perpetuating and even increasing the risk of nuclear use, there has to be a time where we are looking at ourselves and saying, okay, what are we doing to perpetuate this? And what can we do to step back from that brink? So I think where my concern is with both of these, both the China point and with the allies point, is that they're being used to shut down conversation. It's like we can't even have a conversation about it. And that's exactly those conversations that we need to be having about our security concerns and how we can move away from relying so much on nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction.
Excellent point. And last question to you before we have to wrap this up. There have been reports that there are some, say in the Pentagon, they're actually trying to prevent some options on no first use or sole purpose from even getting to the president's desk. In your view, is this process being run fairly, and what role should the president ultimately play?
I think the administration in this nuclear posture review process is dealing with a deeply ingrained and entrenched nuclear bureaucracy that has its kind of claws in the nuclear posture review in a way that it is very hard to dislodge. And it is very hard to, as we've been saying, even have conversations, real conversations that are not just dismissed, that is not just checking the box of, oh, we consulted these experts who have a different opinion, but we already know what we want to do. Biden's leadership is imperative in this review process. If he's not getting the options that he needs in reducing the role of nuclear weapons in US national security, he needs to say, why did I not get these options? Go back to the drawing board and give me those options.
Excellent. There's the siren. Jessica, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hi. My name is Chase Enright, and I'm the development coordinator at Plowshares Fund. I'm also a dedicated listener to Press the Button and an advocate for eliminating nuclear weapons. Whether you're a baby boomer, Gen Xer, millennial, or a member of Generation Z like me, I believe it's crucial that we learn about and speak up on nuclear weapons issues, because nuclear weapons affect all our lives. That's why in-depth discussions on nuclear policy and national security, like the ones on Press the Button, are so important. To help us continue our work and support the podcast, please donate to Plowshares Fund. Whether it's $5 or $5,000, every last bit helps. We rely on the generosity of supporters and listeners just like you to fund our work to foster the next generation of nuclear scholars and activists and spread the boldest ideas for reducing the global nuclear threat. As we often hear on Press the Button, our work is more crucial than ever. Please help us keep the conversation going by visiting plowshares.org and donate today.
Terrell Jermaine Starr is founder and host of the foreign policy podcast Black Diplomats and author of the upcoming book Black Man on the Steps, My Odyssey from Detroit to Eastern Europe. He is a senior non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and before this, he was a senior reporter for The Root. He is also the recipient of Plowshares Fund's Estrin Award, a grant named in honor of the late Plowshares Fund Chair Emeritus Mary Lloyd Estrin. Terrell, welcome back to the show.
Hey, I'm happy to be back.
So let's get straight into it. As you know, negotiations between the signatories of the Iran deal are scheduled to restart at the end of November. What are you watching right now?
There are several things. One, the Iranians are asking for a guarantee that America will not renege on their commitments. And I'm curious as to how America is going to respond to that. And so there seems to be a lot more of a hardline approach to it now, particularly given the last election. And basically, I'm also interested in how the media reports on it, because contrary to popular belief, it was America via Trump in 2018 that pulled out of the deal when the Iranians were, on the most part, abiding by all of the rules. And I don't have a lot of optimism for this, that the media will cover that better and realize that it was America that really screwed up. And then also, I'm particularly interested in the Iranians' tactics. What more are they going to ask for with the deal? Because technically they're able to do it, because they've always sworn that they don't have an interest in achieving a weapon, right? Or enriching uranium to the point where they can create a weapon, which is also something that in the media that's inaccurately discussed, because people just assume that if you enrich uranium, you're automatically creating a weapon. We both know that's not true. So, I just hope that there's more education, a lot more of a sophisticated outlook on Iran. But unfortunately, I'm not particularly optimistic. So
I'm glad you brought that up, because this is actually one of the reasons we wanted you to come on the show. You're about to have an upcoming series on your podcast that I think may address exactly that. Can you tell us more about it and what drove you to put it together?
The reason why I decided to create a series on Iran, which is titled Iran in Context, is because literally Iran is talked about in mainstream media with little to virtually no context. We're already dealing with a press corps that severely misunderstands how nuclear weapons work, doesn't understand disarmament, and our media have picked Iran as the boogeyman, right? Iran is the bad actor. And so there's an extreme bias against this country, and how this hurts the American public is that we don't understand what the Iranians are looking for, what they want as it pertains to this deal. And also, I just want to really unpack this language about the Iranians this and the Iranians that. Iran is a country of more than 80 million people, and the only ways that we've learned about this country have been through war. And what my series is going to do is to, episode by episode, learn a different aspect about this region. So next week, we're going to have on an Iranian expert who will talk about how September 11th shaped how she views her own identity as an Iranian, and how that drove her to become an expert in the field. And her name is Asal Rad. And for those who follow Iran Twitter, particularly in English, they'll know that she's constantly pushing back against misinformation and biased reporting on Iran. And so she's going to give us a deep dive into how September 11th shaped her life, because Iran was a part of of Bush's axis of evil. And also, I'm going to talk about my own ignorance and how, being a Black American now that I understand empire and colony, I'm thinking beyond how that impacts Black people. I'm thinking about how this impacts people of color around the world. And Iran is a focus because I'm passionate about nuclear disarmament, and I'm interested in making this subject simpler and easier for people to understand, because it ultimately deals with security. And what the Iran in Context series is going to do is talk about how Iranians themselves imagine security. And notice I keep saying Iranian experts. I will have no white men in this series. Every episode is going to feature an actual Iranian who will unpack different aspects of history, music, media, and local politics in ways that people outside of Washington can understand. I'm really excited about it. And I think that my series is going to be one of the most unique ways that we understand, that we've ever been able to understand Iran. I'm really excited about it.
I really appreciate your focus on uplifting voices from the region. And, I don't need to explain to you, but for our listeners out there, this is something you do over the course of all of your work. Your travels in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, in Russia, I think is how I first encountered your work. And it's something I really appreciate. And actually, I want to switch gears to talking about U.S.-Russian relations. What do you make of the recent strategic stability talks, and where do you see relations headed? I know you were recently in Eastern Europe, so I'm curious to hear your perspective on it.
So here's my theory about all of this. First, from the nuclear front, I don't know if you saw that Russia conducted I forgot what platforms they were. I don't know if they were bombers or what, that flew over Belarus. And, and they're nuclear capable. And again, I don't know if they're bombers. I forgot what platform. And the idea that the Kremlin, conducted this exercise over Belarus, the last dictatorship of Europe, I believe Condoleezza Rice, whose politics I don't agree with, but her statement on Belarus is accurate. The fact that Russia did that tells you that they're bolstering up their own defenses and threatening the region, but also it's bigger than nuclear weapons themselves. It's really about Russia. Russia is really concerned about maintaining its military might. And we see an escalation in the types of weaponry that's being tested. And you also see in Washington a slow but grudging admittance that missile defense needs to be put back on the table. Now, I know that there's a very slim chance that America will seriously negotiate taking down missile defense systems. And because you'll have a number of Democrats that will vote against that, not just Republicans. And also, too, I have to ask, is Biden really serious about nuclear disarmament, right? Don't really know. And what you would hope would happen is that he would do better than Obama, for whom he served as a vice president. Given everything that's happening in China, with their hypersonic missile development, which I know we'll get into later, it's a crossroads in a way, because one, what's happening in China is definitely connected to Russia. Will the hypersonic missiles test create a new weapons race with the hypersonic or maneuverable platforms, the glide platforms? So I guess what I'm trying to say is there are people in Washington who I suspect, and based on statements over the past few months, understand that missile defense needs to be on the table. But will a Biden administration do that? And they're not giving a lot of signs either. But that's what I'm looking at.
No, I'm so glad you brought up missile defense, because I think this is actually getting to, this bigger issue. But before we get into China, getting to this bigger issue of this arms race and the domestic components here in the United States, the questions about, whether the Biden administration will take bold steps related to arms control, things that could lead to a de-escalation. I'm curious, besides missile defense, are there other things that you are looking for from the administration that would signal their seriousness about trying to change that trend line?
I haven't seen any signals, no, because just look at the culture of Congress right now, particularly with the infrastructure bill. Right now we have a Congress that culturally doesn't realize that things like missile defense are essentially useless. And when you think about the infrastructure bill, the idea that you have even Democrats who are downscaling the amount of money that ought to go into rebuilding our infrastructure. And all these things are connected because it deals with what is true security. And the Biden administration has not really signaled that they're ready to have a cultural shift. That's the issue, right? There are a lot of technical elements to missile defense and everything. Also, how we're going to look at New START. And, the number of deployed weapons are around 1,550. That's the number that's in my head right now. Do I see any window that could drop down to 1,000? From Putin's angle, that definitely is not the case, because Putin knows that his conventional army doesn't stand a chance against NATO or America, one-on-one. And so the only way for Putin to maintain any semblance of the Soviet power that he so often discusses and regrets. And for me, what I would hope would happen is that America would decide to dial down unilaterally. I don't see that signal. What I do see is they're trying to figure out a political way where they both show strength, but will that deal with the issues that we care about, which is disarmament? I have to say that I don't see that. I don't see us going down below 1,000 deployed weapons. I don't see any major reductions in our stockpiles. That could change in the next year or so, but right now I feel like everybody's just digging their heels in.
So this brings up the question of China, right? Because, you have this bilateral relationship, but as we know, globally, nothing happens in a vacuum. As we're taping this podcast, we are waiting to see what comes of a virtual summit that's been scheduled between President Biden and General Secretary Xi. China has become a huge point of contention here in the United States, as you were commenting, especially this recent news about its hypersonic missile test. And so what impact do you see that element having, that threat, whatever level of threat it is as it's perceived here in the United States?
A lot of people, I don't think, understand what they are, because in theory, the idea is that this is going to be another escalation, or the one general, I forgot his name, said that this was a Sputnik moment, which I thought that was a little bit of a exaggeration.
Yes, General Milley. Yeah, General Milley said it was a Sputnik moment.
Which is an extreme exaggeration for a wide range of reasons, because, look, just from a technical standpoint, we don't know much about this hypersonic missile test. That's the first thing, right? If you look at the Financial Times article where they first reported, we don't know much about it because the Chinese don't talk about their nuclear weapons program at all. They rarely do. And secondly, it's inconsequential because China has already been able to attack America with its ICBM systems for decades now. And we haven't been able to stop that with our ground midcourse system. And so this test is a nothing burger for me. What I do worry about is that it's going to add on to even more ignorance about how these weapons work, and people taking on this conventional mindset of, okay, you're creating hypersonic missile technology or maneuverable technology, and so we're going to do the same. And so you're just ratcheting up the potential of an arms race that's not going to lead us to being more safe and secure. Now, let's go to another, what I think is an important point of why do I think the Chinese are doing this? There are several reasons. One, because we saw this with their silo buildup. And, this past summer, we don't know if all of those silos, surely they likely don't have missiles in them. But my theory is that the Chinese are preparing for 2024, when Trump, in my opinion, will ultimately become the nominee. And keep in mind that I believe it was General Milley. I think that he was speaking with his counter. He had to warn his counterpart that, hey, we're not going to invade you. The Chinese genuinely believe that Trump was threatening an attack on China. And listen, given that Trump has attacked our own democracy, I think that the concerns out of Beijing are quite legitimate. And so between the silo buildup and the maneuverable missile development in these recent tests, I think that they're worried about their own defenses embracing for a Trump presidency in 2024. My gut, because I don't know, and I think a lot of people don't know, is that they're thinking about Trump, and that this has less to do with this current administration than it does with Trump. What I hope is happening right now is that America is talking to the Chinese to understand why they're doing this, because we don't understand why they're doing this. So I hope they're having this conversation, and I hope that policymakers in DC are exercising calm. But given the culture of Congress in this past year, there's nothing calm about this Congress. even on the Democratic side, right? Because when it comes down to defense, that's something that Democrats and Republicans have always approved our bloated Pentagon budget. And we know that the Pentagon has asked for billions of dollars in hypersonic missile technology, right? And we know that they tend to get what they want. And so I think this is just going to add to more ignorance about nuclear weapons because the majority of people in Congress don't understand how they work to begin with. So this is just another long-winded way of saying that the hypersonic missile development is going to add to more ignorance because this is just another piece of technology that most people are not going to get, but they're going to overreact to.
So our time is starting to come to a close, but I can't resist going back. You've commented a couple times about how, we're talking about these weapons and how they're supposed to bring us security, and they don't. What do you think policymakers should be looking towards to actually build real safety or real support or real security for the people that they serve?
We're not going to get that answer from people in Washington because what needs to happen is this needs to be a grassroots effort. We need to educate the American public about what safety and security is and make this a coffee table conversation where we discuss how ridiculous and how useless these weapons are and how much of a burden they are for the taxpayer, and talk about the benefits of what it means to divest from nuclear weapons development and to invest that into things like education, into climate change, into food. Because I think that the Washington crowd, they're already made their minds up. It has to be the movement that will really shift thinking on nuclear weapons is going to have to be as grassroots as the defund the police movement, as the same thing as the people who are marching to the streets about George Floyd. We need a similar type of energy for nuclear weapons because otherwise nothing is going to change. I mean, you know how long we've had these conversations and we're speaking to the choir. We need to speak to the people and get them to care. And that's what I am doing. That is what I am excited about because I'm engaging with people in Washington, but my real interest is dealing with the people, which is why I've created my podcast in a way that it could be digestible for the common person. And what I hope will happen is that I can get the common person to think more about Iran, to think more about why is my media making me afraid of these people? Why are people telling me that these violent weapons are going to make me secure when we have hundreds of thousands of people who are dying from COVID-19 and millions who are getting sick by it, right? So our whole thinking needs to change, and that's not going to come out of Washington, unfortunately.
Terrell, it is always a pleasure to have you on. For our listeners who want to hear your new series, where can they go?
So for those who want to hear my new series, Iran in Context, please go to Black Diplomats. We are on all major podcast platforms, and I consider myself to have the dopest foreign policy podcast out there. You're going to have fun. You're going to learn. This is not going to be the pink champagne sipping crowd. And this is basically foreign policy for dummies. So if you feel like you want to learn something and somebody's not talking down to you, Black Diplomats is the best place to go. And we're on all podcasting platforms. And you can follow me on Twitter currently at Russian_.com, even though I'm going to have my Twitter handle changed to my regular name. But for now, Russian_Starr with 2 R's.com. And so you'll be able to get information about the podcast there as well.
Terrell, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.